So after you've played the Great Circle Order of the Giants DLC, you probably might be a little confused as to how do all those pieces fit together? What does it actually mean? Why do you have a mixture of Crusades and the Minotaur and the Colosseum, etc., etc.? So yeah, if you haven't played the DLC yet, I suggest playing the DLC first, and then kind of listening to this, because I'm going to try to put together the different pieces and try to make a more cohesive whole based off of the evidence in the game itself. Now, the game itself isn't entirely explicit at all times, but they give several hints. We know that the giants arrived at Rome at some point, and then one of them became a gladiator, and the other two later on became crusaders. At least one, well, all three likely became crusaders, but one became the most famous crusader of the three, the Nameless Crusader. And eventually, two of them died, and the one that was the gladiator continued to live until Indy fought him. But what happened in between? Why is that the case? Well, let's go through them one by one. So we know Junia is the only woman of the three, but she's also the leader of the three as well. So based off of the cylinder seal that Indy puts together and uses. And we know that we don't really know if she's related to any biblical figure directly per se, but her name is the same name as one of the women in the New Testament. So she's an early follower mentioned by Peter in the Bible. But the biblical Junia is sometimes also, by some scholars, equated with Joanna, the wife of Chusa, who is another character. That is one of the three women who discovered Jesus' tomb to be empty. So the argument being that Junia and Joanna are kind of different translations of the same person's name. Okay, so we know that she's a devout Christian at least, even if we don't know if the game is trying to connect her with the biblical figures of Joanna and Junia. And we know that she fought in the Crusades, likely fought in the Crusades as one of the three crusaders that we see in Gibborim's tomb. There's a constant emphasis on three arrivals, three crusaders, things like that. So there's a likelihood that she was also one of the three. And yeah, her statue in her tomb shows her protecting several other people at her feet. So kind of she is presented as this kind of protective angel, and she's actually the only one of the three to be consistently depicted both in this clay tablet that we find in the room with the helmet, for her to have wings, as well as her statue in her tomb also has wings. So of the three, she seems to be the only one depicted in that way. Not really clear why, but definitely the most angelic of the three, it seems. She also passed away and was buried under the Vatican, but not as a knight and more as an angel, which is also different from Gibborim's tomb. And but actually, even though she's the first one that we see, I think she's actually the second one to pass away, because her statue is in a much later style than Gibborim's. Gibborim's is kind of aping the style of kind of the Crusades, right? It's trying to evoke that, even though if it's not entirely accurate. So anyone who's more familiar with that stuff, you'll probably find a mixture of different styles that aren't exactly accurate to the First Crusades, especially the helmet, I would say. But yeah, but overall, it is trying to evoke an earlier kind of style matching the time of the Crusades when Gibborim passed away. The statue of Junia is in a much later style, maybe 1600s and 1700s, I would say, because it's closer to actually a few of the statues in front of the Castel Sant'Angelo. There's one angel statue holding a cross, and then there's a statue of, I believe it's Saint Michael holding a sword at the top of Castel Sant'Angelo, and those date to the 1600s and 1700s. So that's why I would place her as the second to pass away. Hers is also the one that's most actively guarded by a current member of the Vatican. So when Indy takes the cylinder, immediately one of the giants of the current Vatican order drops by to go and fight Indy. So that's a very different situation than at Gibborim's tomb, or of course Abgal has like no other giants guarding him or being around as well. Only the resurrected kind of pseudo cult of Mithras cult that Father Ricci tries to recreate, basically. We know that so we know the least info otherwise, even though we see her tomb first. So that's as far as I think we know of her character. Now, as for Gibborim, Gibborim means great one or mightiest. It can be used for lions and humans several different times in the Old Testament, many different times in the Old Testament actually. And in Genesis, it's also a word that's associated with the Nephilim. So there's sort of a use of it as being kind of mighty, mightiest. Apologies to anyone who's more of a specific scholar in this area. So if you're a philologist, or I apologize if I'm kind of oversimplifying anything or making it or conflating anything. But this is, as far as I understand it to be, what the term Gibborim means. It isn't only associated with one individual. He's also known as the Nameless One. By the time of the Crusades, we know he arrived in Rome as well, but we don't know, let's say, if it was a gladiator or not. There's only really one gladiator that we know of the three. There are no three gladiators, for example, in any of the puzzles. So, whereas there are three crusaders in Gibborim's tomb. So we know he's also a devout Christian. Fought in the Crusades, he is identified as the Guardian, whereas Junia is the leader, Gibborim is the Guardian, that cylinder seal. And he fell in love. After the siege of Antioch, he fell in love, and then he fought a second battle in the city, whose name I forgot now. And he was buried as a crusader as a result. And I would say that him and Junia, and possibly Abgal, were first of the Vatican-aligned order. So the Order of Giants refers to the order that these three create, and particularly the one that would be led by Junia. And that's the same order that Locus is a part of, and the other giants that we see in the main story of the game. So now there's also this thing about the Antioch's secret in the initial map that we see when we go into the tunnels to reach Junia's tomb. It's not really clear or clarified what the secret of Antioch is, because we aren't really finding anything that's like an object per se. The cylinder seal refers to the monster's gate and the secret location underneath the Colosseum. The only other artifact that we have is the dagger of Mithras, which I don't think is the secret of Antioch, because that doesn't make any much sense per se. They could be playing on the ideas of the Holy Grail, because there is a so-called cup of Antioch that is actually not even a cup, as it turns out. So it's kind of up for debate what I could be referring to. There are some other events that did occur at the Siege of Antioch, granted. The Holy Lance, or the so-called Holy Lance, was found by, or supposedly found by, Peter Bartholomew. And so, again, we have another kind of Lance of Longinus reference. Indy seems to be associated with and surrounding the Holy Lance and the Grail one way or another. And so, and we do know that Indy does find the Grail in the next kind of 1 year later in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and we have a little bit of several different events where Indy possibly finds the Holy Lance. We have the fake one in Destiny, and we have the one in Indiana Jones and the Spear of Destiny. So if you're interested in that, you could read more about that. And finally, we have Abgal. So Abgal is the name of a real-life Palmyran deity, and later thought of as a jinn, or kind of spirit. And so whether or not they're trying to relate it back to that, maybe. And I think it could fit into the character, because Abgal is treated as the final monster to defeat in the kind of in this cult of Mithras. And yeah, the cult of Mithras in the Roman version is actually also kind of a riff on Zoroastrian tradition as well. So it's sort of, I mean, I guess it's just thematically similar, I guess, in that sense. So he's called the Minotaur, or the Cretan monster, which is actually kind of the weird part of Abgal's story, because in the cylinder seal that Indy puts together, he reads off Junia as the leader, Gibborim as the guardian, and Abgal as the Minotaur. Like one of these three doesn't really fit in the theme. Why would you have leader, guardian, Minotaur? It It's kind of a weird point, but I would say that maybe that is because Abgal's the one that made the cylinder or has the cylinder, who's kind of hid this cylinder. He's the one that's still living, who would have been able to tend to or put secrets around the tombs and create those puzzles. And he has a very weird. He's not actually, of course, the Minotaur, but he's named so as a gladiator for the Roman Emperor Nero. And this is kind of really weird because Nero was famous for torturing and persecuting Christians and Jews. So, like, why would somebody join Nero in this way? It doesn't really make any sense. It's possible that he was worshipped as part of the Mithraic mysteries, though not continuously so. Right? We know that Father Ricci was actually only just trying to revive a version of it. And there's no indication that Father Ricci was actually a part of a pre-existing or continuing Mithraic mystery before he started recruiting people. So he kind of just named himself the leader, and then he just went on his business of trying to find Abgal. So it's possible, it's likely that Abgal, though, still is one of the three crusaders that we see in Gibborim's tomb. But, of course, we see him wearing his gladiator gear when we meet him. So why is that the case, right? Why is there this cylinder that accesses the area that he's in? So I would say that it's possible that after Gibborim passed away and Junia passed away, he kind of felt lonely. He's had a sense of loneliness for the glory days, maybe some PTSD as well. He's really the only one alive of the three, and likely the designer of the traps and puzzles. We don't see other giants helping him or anything like that, though maybe that was the case in the past. He seems to at least have been the overarching designer of these puzzles. Right? He would have had to be the one of the three to have hid the three different cylinder parts himself. Otherwise, there's no direct relation to Junia having cylinder pieces to open this monster gate that leads to this secret area underneath the Coliseum where they keep the monsters, where they keep the animals and the and slaves, and also Abgal himself. Right? It doesn't make any sense for the other two to be buried with this unless Abgal was the one to bury them and to hide these pieces. Yeah, and he has his own little gladiator trap puzzle to hide his piece of the cylinder. There's no tomb again, at the end of which has Nero presenting it. So again, there's this weird, these kind of more Roman style areas at the end, and this kind of worship of Nero. And so I would say he either sealed or had others lock himself in until someone found him for one last fight. And he has the convenient lever to access the Colosseum, and he killed a variety of people that have visited him, it seems. And so I guess, yeah, even though it's treated as the final challenge of the Mithraic cult to fight him, maybe that's the case. But it also could be the case that he's basically kind of in this weird state after living so many years to basically just have everyone, to just kind of lock himself in, think of the glory days, think of the time when he was lauded as this Minotaur figure in gladiatorial battles, which he probably like defeated everyone in, but which also means that he's basically excommunicated or separated from the rest of the church. No other giants seem to really be spending time with him or really defending him. They'll defend Junia, but Abgal's very he's basically worshipping a Roman emperor as well himself, who persecuted Christians. So he's really kind of set himself as someone separate, and which also kind of, for the developers when they're designing the game, I think that maybe is what creates a bit of confusion for players, because it has a separate theme to it. But I guess it also adds to it. I mean, I still appreciate it because you're seeing the Colosseum that way, which is pretty cool. So in the end, this seems to be the chronology. We have their origins in the Near East, so possible ties to Old Testament and New Testament events or other Near Eastern religions, either survivors of the flood or descendants based on the game's overall history. We eventually have their arrival in Rome, and Abgal becomes a gladiator under Nero despite his persecution of Christians. And he becomes a figure in the fictionalized version of the Mithraic cult I would say that maybe this creates a slight fracturing of the group because Junia and Gibborim likely were more devout Christians, or regardless, they became devout Christians in contrast. And eventually, though all three, I guess, eventually were associated, and eventually allying themselves with the office of the Pope, as that's created, and the founding of the Vatican's quote unquote Order of the Giants, or Order of Giants. And the Vatican's order then begins the process of documenting and collecting sacred holy relics throughout the Near East and Near and Middle East and the Holy Land, more generally speaking. And the three, well, I guess Near East and Middle East is a broader term than Holy Land. So yeah, sorry, correcting myself on that. But yeah, the three become crusaders, which makes sense as they likely came from the region, so they would want to be a part of, and becoming devout Christians, they would want to then be a part of that effort in the first crusades. I would say the Abgal thing also continues to be a little confusing. I would say it's possible that Abgal, without the gladiatorial battles to sustain him, kind of turned to join his, I don't know, siblings or friends to go and just fight the crusades for the sake of fighting the crusades, basically fighting battles, basically. Yeah, and unfortunately, Gibborim, of course, dies in the crusades, and Junia lives through all the crusades and eventually dies as a respected member of the order. Abgal, on the other hand, spirals out, never having actually been much of a devout follower of the church. He sets puzzles, locks himself in, waiting for one big ego-centered battle to the death in the Coliseum, basically. So that's what I have in terms of who these three giants are, how they fit into the history of the game, and why they exist the way they do. So if you have any other thoughts, I'd really love to see them in the comments. Otherwise, if you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.